Snow had blanketed the valley in a hush so deep it muffled even the sound of grief. High in the Carpathian Mountains, where the air was thin and the roads thinner, the village of Bailemika had always lived in cautious harmony with the winter. Avalanches were not rare here. They were rhythms, dangerous but known. What happened on the third day of the storm, though, was not known. It was unthinkable. Locals would later say they heard it before they saw it. The low groan of snow shifting above the ridge, the sickening crack of a frozen shelf giving way. And then silence, just for a moment, the kind of silence that tells you something has been taken. Then came the roar. The side of the mountain didn't collapse so much as it unraveled, layer upon layer of packed snow and debris crashing down in slow, terrible waves. Entire trees snapped like twigs. Smoke-colored clouds of ice choked the air. And in the middle of it, a small log cabin, one that hadn't been marked on any rescue map, disappeared. When they reached the wreckage 2 days later, there was almost nothing left. Just splinters, and a trail of paw prints, fresh, oddly deliberate, leading away from the chaos down toward the tree line. The rescuers followed them, not expecting much. Maybe a dog that had survived. Maybe it had gone to find food. Or maybe, just maybe, it had gone to find help. 3 kilometers down the slope, near a clump of frost-bitten pines, they found the source. A medium-sized Pyrenean shepherd, mud-caked, one ear half torn, chest rising in shallow wheezes, curled tightly around something wrapped in a frayed baby blanket. They thought it was a trick of the light at first, but then it moved. It was a baby, alive, and the dog had not moved in over 36 hours. They named him Veci, Romanian for old, not because of his age, but because of the way he carried himself. Quiet, heavy, as if the world had left weight on his shoulders that he'd never asked for but had chosen to bear anyway. No one knew where he'd come from. He had no collar, no tag, no chip. Just a ragged rope scar around his neck, partially hidden beneath his matted fur, and a deep, unreadable gaze that never settled for long on anything. The infant, they discovered, was just under 6 months old. No parents found. No other bodies recovered. The avalanche had swallowed everything but these two, the dog and the child. One silent, one crying, both covered in frost, and yet both alive. At the hospital, the baby, later named Anna, was treated for mild hypothermia and dehydration, but miraculously showed no signs of frostbite. Doctors couldn't understand it. A child that young, exposed to sub-zero temperatures for more than a few hours, should not have survived, let alone with warm limbs and clear lungs. But when they examined the fleece blanket she had been wrapped in, they found it soaked through with moisture, except for the inside. The place where her tiny chest had rested was dry, protected, heated by fur. Veci had curled around her and never moved, had shielded her from the wind, had refused to leave her, even as his own body began to falter, even as his breaths grew slower, shorter. When they found them, the rescuers said his body had been shaking, barely hanging on, but his eyes had stayed open, watching her, waiting. Some said it was instinct. The dogs had a natural compulsion to protect the young, but others, those who had seen his eyes, weren't so sure. There was something else there, something deliberate. Later, an old farmer from a nearby village claimed he remembered a dog like Veci. Said he used to belong to a man who lived alone in the woods, a trapper who died 2 winters back. No one had been to the cabin since. Maybe Veci had wandered, maybe he had returned, or maybe he had stayed, waiting for something to come back to life. What no one could explain was how he had gotten to that cabin, or why, once the snow had fallen and buried everything, he had dug. Not at random, not frantically, but in a slow, relentless circle, clearing the snow away with numb paws and bleeding pads, until a patch of roof broke open just wide enough for him to slip inside. He hadn't barked. He hadn't run. He had just pulled her from the wreckage and laid beside her, and stayed. The news spread quickly. Videos, headlines. Dog saves baby after avalanche. Miracle in the mountains. But Veci didn't care for cameras. He never looked into them. His eyes always searched past the lens, past the crowd, as if looking for something that wasn't quite there. Or maybe someone. Anna was placed with a foster family, a kind couple who lived on the edge of the same forest where she had nearly died. They asked to adopt Veci too, said they couldn't separate the two, not after that. And for the first time since the avalanche, the dog moved with purpose. He walked into their home and curled up beside Anna's crib. And for the first time, he slept. Not the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion or the involuntary collapse of a body pushed too far, but the kind that comes when something deep inside finally believes it's over, that the waiting is done, that no one else needs saving, that the storm has passed, not just outside, but within. He began to age quickly after that. His fur grew grayer, his steps slower, but no one minded. Anna had taken to crawling toward him every morning, babbling nonsense only he seemed to understand. And every time she reached him, he would lift his head, just slightly, and press his nose to her cheek. It became their ritual. No commands, no tricks, just presence. They grew in parallel, her body gaining strength, his letting go of it, as if, in some unspoken way, he was passing it on. Each giggle from her lips, a little less pain in his joints. Each new step from her feet, a little less burden on his heart. And though he never strayed far from her, he no longer hovered. He no longer watched every breath, every rustle, because he didn't have to, because she was safe now. Sometimes at dusk, they'd sit on the old wooden porch, her small hand tangled in the fur behind his ear, her tiny fingers stroking what was left of the tear on his half-missing one. And though he'd lost so much, he never flinched, never pulled away, because she touched him like he wasn't broken, like nothing had been taken, like all he had ever been was enough. And in those quiet twilight hours, as the sun slipped behind the trees and the wind carried only peace, there was no avalanche, no wreckage, no pain, just a girl and a dog, watching the sky change together, not in fear, but in memory, of snow that never fully melted, of silence that once meant fear and now simply meant calm, of a life that began the moment another almost ended. They didn't know it then, neither Anna in her smallness, nor Veci in his weariness. But the world around them had already started to retell their story. Not as a miracle, but as proof. Proof that something didn't need to be whole to protect. That a creature who had once been discarded, overlooked, maybe even forgotten, could become the thin line between life and death and hold it, with nothing but breath and fur and unrelenting stillness. There were days when Anna would point to the mountains and say things that made no sense to the adults. She'd wave toward the horizon and call it home, even though she'd never remember the avalanche, or the wreckage, or the way the cold had almost taken her. But Veci would lift his head each time and watch with eyes that remembered everything. And when she cried, because all children do, he would press his forehead to her ribs and wait. Just wait, because that was all he had ever done. Not rushed, not panicked, just waited until it passed. Even when the vet whispered words the family didn't want to hear, Veci didn't look afraid. He looked tired, not in pain, just ready. Like the job he hadn't known he was given had finally come to an end. Like the weight he'd carried since the snow first fell had finally been set down. Not because she didn't need him anymore, but because she knew he had been there, and that would always be enough. Not because the world had finally noticed him, or because the cameras had captured the softness in his sacrifice, but because in the quiet spaces where no one watched, love had done what it was always meant to do. It had stayed when everything else had crumbled, when the snow had buried homes and hopes alike. He had remained, not for praise, not for purpose, just for her. And though his legs no longer held the same strength, and his breath sometimes trembled with the weight of time, he still rose each morning to meet her. Even when she began to run ahead of him, her laughter chasing birds down the path behind the house, he followed, slower now, but never absent, because that's what he had taught her, that real protection wasn't loud, wasn't fast. It was patient, it was constant, it was there. There were moments, soft, almost imperceptible, when she'd reach for him with the same instinct she once had as a baby, curling her fingers into the place where his fur grew thin and silvered. and he'd lean into it with the gentleness of someone who knew it might be the last time, but who also knew that it wouldn't matter, because it had happened at all, because somewhere in the hush between disaster and deliverance, they had become something more than a rescue story. They had become a reminder that bonds forged in silence, in pain, in moments no one sees, can still echo, even after the sound fades, even after the body lets go. And maybe that's why, on the morning they found him lying beneath the window, his head resting near her shoes, the family didn't cry right away. They sat beside him instead, not to grieve, but to thank him, not just for saving her life, but for shaping it, for staying, until he knew she could walk into the world without him, but never alone, because in every step she would take from that moment forward, there would always be a part of him walking quietly beside her, in the soft rhythm of her breath on cold mornings, in the instinct to sit patiently with someone else's sadness, in the way she would later wrap her arms around the abandoned, the lost, the frightened, and wait with them, just as he had waited with her. And as she grew, so did the story, not in the retelling, but in the remembering. It became less about a baby and a dog, and more about what they had taught each other without words. That heroism isn't loud. That love doesn't need a name. That family is not always blood, but the one who wraps around you when the world disappears and refuses to let go. There were no plaques, no statues, just a weathered collar with no tag resting on a shelf near her bed, and an old blanket folded in the corner of her room, never washed, still holding the faintest trace of his scent. She would press her face into it some nights, not because she had forgotten, but because she hadn't. Because memory, when rooted in love, never fades. Even when the world moves on, even when the house falls quiet, even when the snow melts, even when the scent of pine returns and the valley hums with green again, the silence they once shared remains, not empty, not broken, but full of all that had passed between them without ever needing to be spoken. The mountain no longer felt like a grave. It felt like the beginning, because the place where she was almost lost became the place where she was truly found. Years later, when Anna would be asked about the dog who saved her, she never called him a hero. She never used words like miracle or fate. She would just smile softly and say, "He stayed." And those two words would quiet every room, because everyone knew what that meant: to stay when no one else does. To endure, not because you expect to be remembered, but because something inside you refuses to leave what matters behind. And that's what he had done. He had stayed through the cold, through the hunger, through the silence, through the fear, until warmth came back, until sound returned, until her tiny heart beat loud enough to fill the silence he had kept at bay. And even now, when she walks paths he never did, when she speaks languages he never knew, when she comforts others in ways he once comforted her, he is still there. Not in shadow, but in shape. Not in memory, but in motion. Every kindness, every stillness, every moment she chooses to stay is his. His legacy was never meant to be loud. It lived in quiet choices, the way she sat with those who had no one, the way she paused before judging, the way she wrapped her arms around fear and stayed with it until it softened. People would call her gentle, strong, wise beyond her years, but she never took credit because she knew where it came from a heartbeat once pressed against hers in the cold, from breath shared beneath a broken roof, from the kind of love that doesn't ask to be seen, only to be felt. Sometimes on the coldest nights, she would find herself walking without knowing why, out to the edge of the woods where the frost grew thick and the wind remembered everything. And she would stand there in the hush, eyes closed, as if listening for footsteps no longer there. And in that stillness, she would smile, because she didn't need to hear them. She already carried them, in the way she loved, in the way she waited, in the way she stayed, through storms of another kind, arguments that shattered the air, hospital nights that stretched into dawn, friends who vanished when the world got too heavy. She didn't run. She didn't shut down. She sat with it, All of it, because she had learned long before she understood the lesson that staying is not weakness, that it's a form of strength most hearts forget they have. And sometimes, just before sleep, she would glance at the blanket still folded in the corner of her room, faded now, threadbare in places, but sacred. Not because it had once warmed her body, but because it had once held the warmth of something she could never put into words. Something that had no language, no promise, no explanation, only presence. That blanket, that memory, that dog. They didn't ask for gratitude. They asked only to be remembered, and she did. Not with grief, but with quiet honor. Because while the world rushed forward, demanding noise and motion and progress, she carried stillness like a gift. The stillness he had taught her, the kind that says, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, and that is enough." So she stayed with others, even when they pushed her away. She stayed through the uncomfortable silences, the long recoveries, the uncertain beginnings. And when people asked her why she cared so deeply, why she showed up for strangers, why she gave more than she had, they never expected the answer. But she always gave it anyway. Because someone once stayed for me, not when it was easy, not when there was hope or certainty or reward, but when everything smelled like fear and ash, when my breath was barely mine, when the cold had crept into my bones and the silence was so loud it felt like it would swallow me whole. He stayed, without being asked, without needing a reason. And in doing so, he gave me one reason to trust, one reason to wait, one reason to live. And that's what I offer now. Not because I'm strong, not because I know what to say, but because I remember what it felt like when someone simply didn't leave, when someone didn't flinch at the mess, when someone saw all the cracks and sat beside them anyway. People think healing comes from fixing, from changing what's broken, but it doesn't. Healing begins the moment someone chooses to sit in the broken with you and say, "You're not alone." That's what he taught me. And that's why, even now, when I see someone on the verge of disappearing into grief, into shame, into whatever storm they've been handed, I stay. Because staying saved me. Not with noise, not with rescue, but with quiet, with breath, with warmth, with the soft weight of fur against my chest as the snow buried the world outside. And something inside me whispered, "This is not the end." Because endings don't feel like that. Endings are cold, hollow things. This was warm, steady, like the earth itself had paused to take a breath with us. Like the avalanche had not taken something, but revealed it. Revealed what love looks like when it has nothing left to prove. What loyalty means when no one is watching. What survival can become when it's rooted in devotion, not desperation. That night I didn't sleep. I just lay there with him, listening to the storm lose its strength, listening to my own heartbeat grow louder. And somewhere between the wind's last howl and the first hint of light curling over the horizon, I realized I hadn't been rescued by a dog. I'd been raised by him, taught how to be human by a creature the world had overlooked. He didn't just carry me through the snow, he carried me into myself. And even now, years later, when the ache of life returns, when the losses stack too high, when the cold creeps back in, I remember the weight of him, not heavy, not burdensome, just present, just enough, just everything. He was gone by spring, no warning, no pain, just a quiet morning where he didn't rise. I found him curled in the same spot where he used to wait for me each day, nose tucked beneath the blanket I once needed to survive. And I didn't cry, not right away, because some goodbyes are too sacred for sound, because what he gave me couldn't be taken, because his love hadn't ended. It had taken root in the choices I made, in the people I stayed for, in the stillness I carried with me, even when the world rushed on. I buried him at the base of the hill where the snow had once tried to claim us both. There's no marker, no stone, just a line of wildflowers that return each year without fail. Bright, defiant, alive. And sometimes I sit there with my back to the wind and my hands resting on the earth, and I whisper the only words that ever really mattered. You stayed. And because you did, so did I. If this story moved you, share it. For every life that was once saved by silence, and every soul still learning to stay.